Yascha Mounk, welcome to Buitenhof. Thanks for coming today. First of all, before we start talking about the title of the book, could you explain the title through something that happened to the president of a university in the spring of 2017, Mr. Weinstein? What happened to him?
Yes, Weinstein was a professor at a university in the state of Washington. And this university had a day in which students and faculty members who are white were called upon to leave campus as a way to demonstrate racism or white supremacy or something like that. But Weinstein said, look, I'm on the left politically, I oppose racism and so on, but I think that form of racial segregation is not the way to fight against those forms of discrimination. This is actually making a mistake. And he was protested by students. They intimidated members of his class. The campus police told him it might not be safe for him to be on campus, and he eventually left the university.
Why is this a perfect example of the title of your book, if you would define the title?
Well, the idea of a trap, the identiteitsval, is that there is a lure, there's something that draws you in, which is the promise in the case of this new ideology that has become very influential on the political left, that you are fighting in the most radical and the most consistent possible way against injustices, forms of discrimination that are very real. But part of the point of a trap is that it ends up being counterproductive, that this lure can draw in smart and well-intentioned people, but it actually makes them go in the wrong direction. And I think this kind of practice is exactly that. I understand the goals of the activists in this case, but starting to see all of society as pitting whites versus people of color, and starting to resegregate our society with affinity groups and other ways of trying to inculcate racial identity in people is not going too far in the right direction. It's actually taking us away from the kind of societies that we should try to build.
It does exactly the opposite of what the aim is. And you have another example that is almost so extreme that it's hard to believe. Your book starts with this anecdote of another school where a mom is protesting the fact that her African-American daughter cannot be in the class. What happens there?
So this is Kyla Posey, an African-American educator in the suburbs of Atlanta. She asked her school whether she could pick a particular teacher or classroom for her child, who was in elementary school, 7 or 8 years old. And at first the school said, sure, send me along the name of a teacher you'd like your daughter to have. And she did, but then the school started to demur and say, no, actually, perhaps that's not possible, and how about she goes to this class? And she asked the principal, what's going on here? Why can't I have the classroom I prefer? And the principal told her, well, that's not the black class. Now, that might sound like a story of straight-up racial discrimination in the American South, as has often been the case in history, until you learn that the principal of the school is herself a black woman who is a progressive politically. And
I couldn't believe this story when I read it. I thought, is this an exotic example? Did this really happen?
So it is typical of a broader set of ideas in progressive education in the United States.
But why did she think that it was a good idea to...
The idea is that to have a healthy development for children, we have to encourage them, as an organization called Embrace Race, which is very influential, puts it, to own their racial identity. That to be good citizens, they have to think of themselves first and foremost in terms of their race, in order, in particular for members of minority groups, to then be able to oppose injustices. And what's become very common in America, especially in the most elite private schools in the country, is that you have a portion of every week in which teachers come in, even as early as second or first grade, when kids are 8 or 7 or 6 years old, and they put the black kids into one classroom, and the Latino kids into a second classroom, and the Asian American kids into a third classroom, and the white kids into a fourth classroom. And I particularly worry about what's going to happen to those white children. Not because they might be uncomfortable, that's fine to be uncomfortable as part of your education sometime, but because everything we know from history and from social science is that how we define the group we're a part of is very malleable, that changes from situation to situation. But once you define yourself as a member of a particular group, you're going to prioritize members of your in-group over the out-group. So even for the hope here is to make these white students own their racial identity in a way that makes them declaim white privilege, turns them into great anti-racists, I think it's much more likely we're creating and educating racists and white supremacists than people who are going to be fighting for social justice.
A year ago, you were here and we spoke about another book that you wrote, Het grote experiment, The Great Experiment. This was about you warning for right-wing parties being very successful, also in Europe. And now we see it happen in Hungary. In the US, there is maybe the chance that Donald Trump will come back. In Russia, it already happened. You warned for the extreme right. Now you are warning us for what we call in the Netherlands maybe woke and extreme left-wing policies. This is a strange transition. Why did you take this subject?
It's perfectly consistent. Even in my first book, warning about the rise of populism, I was worried, for example, about the way in which the left has given up on free speech over the course of the last years. I actually think that if we want to create a genuinely diverse democracy in which we treat everybody as equals, we need to do so on the basis of humanism and universalism, of an insistence that we can understand each other and be friends across the lines of ethnicity and religion.
Would you say these two movements, they connect in the way they operate, extreme right, extreme left?
Well, they have certain ideological similarities, and then politically they end up helping each other. So the ideological similarities are that when I was growing up, not too far from here in Germany, it was the political right that said, we don't really understand anybody who's not from Germany, who's from outside the country. We should be worried about the way in which immigrants are changing our culture. We have to preserve the purity of our culture. Today I hear from the political left that if you stand at a different intersection of identities from me, we can't really communicate, we can't really understand each other. And if, as a member of a supposedly dominant group, I'm in any way influenced by the culture of a minority group, that's a dangerous form of cultural appropriation, where I actually think that is one of the things to celebrate in a deeply diverse city like Amsterdam, rather than something to be worried about. But there's also a political connection, because what we're seeing, and it's very clear in the United States, is that the hold that these quote-unquote woke ideas are starting to have over many mainstream institutions is one of the things that's driving a lot of voters into the hands of right-wing populists.
Did that happen in the Netherlands, you think, as well? You follow European politics. You know that the PVV in the Netherlands had a big win during the last parliamentary elections. Does this tie into the thesis of your book?
So you can answer that question better than I can. I think it's very clearly the case in the United States. So according to an analysis by the New York Times, for example, about 10% of Republican voters are mostly young, mostly non-white, mostly quite progressive on social issues, but deeply worried about the hold of woke ideas on American society. And that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is ahead of Joe Biden in the polls. Now,
try the Dutch elections.
All right. So, look, I think it's unsurprising that the ruling party has lost support. It's an anti-incumbent moment in many countries around the world because of inflation and other things. The party had been in power for, 12 years? So it's not surprising that at some point voters wanted something new. The question is, why did those voters all turn to the right, or the far right, rather than the center or the left? And I do think that has something to do with the mistrust for the Dutch elite, of which you are a part, and I'm part of the American or German elite. It does have something to do, I think, with a sense that they're not listening to how people think and talk, that they perhaps are looking down on average citizens a little bit.
So you're not surprised at what happened here?
I'm not, because it's a trend in other countries as well.
Yeah. Maybe another example that happened this week. What we saw in Congress in Washington, D.C., there was a hearing. 3 presidents of very chic universities were there in the chair. And there was a New York Republican congresswoman who asked her, how do you deal with the demonstrations on your campuses of pro-Palestinian students? And what will you do if they call for genocide against Jews? What then is your policy? And this is how that hearing went. Let's have a look.
I am asking, specifically calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment. It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment.
If the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment? This is unacceptable, Ms. McGill. I'm going to give you one more opportunity for the world to see your answer. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be harassment.
Yes, Yascha Mounk. This is what happened last week. Last night we heard that Liz McGill, the president of the Pennsylvania University, resigned in her position. How does this, again, tie into your book, The Identity Trap?
Well, American universities are in a very deep crisis, and the congressional hearing was just the most sensational indication of that. I watched much of the hearing, and the three university presidents who were there, the presidents of Harvard and MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, failed to articulate what the mission of their university is in a coherent way. And therefore, they failed to explain why academic freedom and free speech is so important on campus. They sometimes made lip service to free speech, saying because of our rules on free speech, we wouldn't be able to punish students who engage in these very disgusting or controversial forms of political speech. Now, I'm somebody who defends free speech, who actually think it is very important to have a very far-reaching conception of free speech that we defend on campus. But the problem with these universities is that each one of them has violated free speech in extreme ways over the course of the last years. Harvard University pushed out a faculty member because she stated on television that there, biologically speaking, are two genders, or two sexes, male and female. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, uninvited a guest speaker because he had, in the pages of Newsweek, opposed affirmative action. UPenn, the university whose president we just heard, is trying to fire a faculty member for speech I personally find offensive, about immigration and what kind of immigrants she prefers to what other kinds of immigrants. So what you cannot do is to effectively limit the things you can say in a university, inscribe a certain kind of orthodoxy, and then in front of Congress, when you're asked about what would happen to somebody calling for the genocide of Jews, suddenly rediscover the principle of free speech and pay lip service to it. Yeah. That hypocrisy is why there was such an outcry. And why Liz McGill ultimately was forced to resign.
You can see this is all very explosive. I think your book is very timely. The last sentence in your book is, and I quote, "We must not let the identity trap lure us into giving up on a future in which what we have in common finally comes to be more important than what divides us." That's exactly what is happening now. It's dividing us. Where is the solution for this?
What I describe in the book is that this is a genuine new ideology, and we have to understand its roots, we have to understand how it came to be so influential, and we have to mount a serious critique of it. And that's what distinguishes my book from some other laments against wokeness. And what I show is that at the core of this ideology is the claim that we have not been able to make any historical progress in how we treat minority groups, and therefore, we need to create a society in which how we treat each other and how the state treats all of us, how our children are educated, always depends on the kind of group of which they are a part. I think when you look historically, we have been able to make progress. The Netherlands is an imperfect society, but it's a much more just, a much more tolerant society than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. The United States is a much more tolerant society when it comes to race or when it comes to sexual orientation than it was 50 or 25 years ago. And we've been able to make that progress historically by trying to live up to our universal principles. By saying, yes, we have not always treated members of every group equally, even though we might have had democratic values that we talked about for a long time. But it is the invocation of those values that has allowed us to make progress. When it comes to gay rights, for example, it is people who said, by what right are you treating our relationships differently from those of heterosexuals? Why are you excluding us from those protections? That is the argument that is won historically, and if we want to create a better society, those are the values in which we have to double down, the values we have to live up to.
And start listening to each other. Is that also your message?
Absolutely. I think, to me, the thing that I find hardest as somebody who's always been on the left is this idea that we're so deeply defined by the group into which we're born, by our quote-unquote race, or by our ethnicity, or by our religion, that we're incapable of that form of mutual understanding. The way to make progress is to understand that your experiences might be different from mine if you're a part of a different group, but that I can come to understand the politically relevant parts of that. But I can come to understand the challenges you might face in society and come to stand in solidarity with you because that violates the vision of a kind of society in which I myself want to live. That, I think, is the real foundation of political solidarity, not the claim that we're not going to understand each other because we have different skin colors.
Yascha Mounk, thanks so much for being here today in Buitenhof. The book is called De Identiteitsval. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet je vooral niet te abonneren, een like of een comment achter te laten. Dat kan natuurlijk ook.
Humanisme komt altijd achteraf als de puinhoop al gebeurd is. Als het ellende al veroorzaakt is. En dan kun je beter kijken, daar is het essay van Orwell gaat erover. Hoe is dat zo gekomen?